The morning Clara Bennett arrived at the Caldwell Ranch, the sun had already begun its climb over the sprawling fields, casting long golden shadows across the fences and barns. She had traveled for days, her belongings packed into a single worn trunk, every step along the dusty road a reminder of the debt she carried and the burdens she bore for her family. Her father's failing business and her younger siblings' needs had left her with few choices, and this arrangement, marriage by contract to a wealthy rancher, was the only way she could see a path to stability. The idea of a marriage for sale made her stomach twist, a mix of anxiety and quiet determination settling over her. She told herself this was a transaction, nothing more. She was not expecting romance, affection, or any trace of love. She was expecting survival when she first laid eyes on Ethan Caldwell, the man who had agreed to pay for her hand in marriage. She was struck by his presence. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man, his dark hair slightly tousled from the morning breeze, his piercing eyes sharp and observant. There was a ruggedness to him, the kind that spoke of years spent under the sun, breaking and building a life from dust and sweat. But there was also a distance, a quiet, formidable wall around him that warned her to keep her expectations low. Ethan, for his part, had not expected much. He had considered this marriage a practical solution, a companion for the house, someone to manage the domestic affairs he didn't have time for, and perhaps a partner who could maintain appearances for the social circles he rarely frequented. He had no illusions about romance or love. That was not part of the transaction. When he saw Clara step off the wagon, dressed modestly in a plain dress with her hair neatly pinned back, he simply assessed her with a careful, professional eye. She was young, capable, and presentable enough to fulfill the requirements of their arrangement. That was all. The initial meeting was awkward, a dance of distance and politeness. Clara curtsied in the formal manner she had been taught, and Ethan nodded in acknowledgment, keeping his expression neutral. Words were exchanged, polite, clipped, and functional. There was no warmth, no spark of connection, only the clear, unspoken understanding that this was a business deal dressed in the trappings of matrimony. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she set her trunk down, reminding her that despite her determination, she was still human. She had left her home in the hope of securing her family's future, but the reality of being bound to a man she barely knew felt heavier than she anticipated. She had to remind herself, this was not about love. It was about duty, about survival, about doing what needed to be done. Ethan watched her carefully, noting the way she held herself, the quiet dignity in her movements. He appreciated her practicality, the subtle strength in her eyes, but he reminded himself that admiration had no place here. This was a contract, not a courtship. Still, something about her, perhaps the resilience he saw in her stance or the way she measured her words, made him pause longer than he expected. Mrs. Caldwell, the housekeeper, intervened with brisk efficiency, guiding Clara through the layout of the house and explaining her duties. She was patient but firm, a mentor and a gatekeeper, ensuring that Clara understood her responsibilities. As Clara moved through the rooms, unpacking her few belongings and preparing to assume her role, she could feel Ethan's eyes on her intermittently, not in an intrusive way, but in quiet observation, cataloging her movements, her grace, and her poise. Though neither admitted it, the tension in the air was tangible. Clara was determined not to let emotion cloud her judgment, and Ethan was determined not to let himself feel anything beyond practicality. Yet beneath the surface, both were aware of an unspoken presence, a subtle spark, a faint curiosity about the person standing before them. Neither would dare acknowledge it yet, but the seeds of something more than duty had already been planted. By the end of the day, Clara had settled into her small room and completed her initial tasks. She was tired, yes, but also relieved. She had made it to the Caldwell Ranch, she had survived the first meeting with Ethan, and she had a chance to carve out security for her family. And though she didn't know it yet, that first day marked the beginning of a journey far beyond the terms of a contracted journey that would awaken hearts, challenge assumptions, and ultimately redefine what both of them thought they wanted from life. The morning after her arrival, Clara Bennett awoke to the sounds of the Caldwell Ranch stirring to life. Horses neighed in the distance, The clatter of tools and boots on wooden floors echoed through the property, and the aroma of fresh bread from the kitchen lingered faintly in the hallways. She rose from her modest room, feeling both excitement and trepidation. She had agreed to this marriage as a means to an end, but now that she was here, living among the routines and expectations of the ranch, the enormity of her decision pressed down on her. Ethan Caldwell, meanwhile, moved through his morning with precise efficiency. A man of habit, he had cultivated the ranch into a thriving enterprise through discipline, attention to detail, and an unwavering commitment to control. He expected nothing less from those around him, including Clara. When he found her stepping nervously into the kitchen, her hands brushing the corners of the counter as if she weren't entirely sure where she belonged, he regarded her coolly, noting her hesitation. "You'll need to familiarize yourself with the household routines quickly," he said, voice calm but firm. "The kitchen, the dining room, the guest quarters, everything runs on schedule here." Clara nodded, forcing a polite smile. "Yes, sir. I will do my best." Ethan's gaze lingered on her briefly, not because he doubted her competence, but because he recognized an independence in her stance that he hadn't anticipated. She moved deliberately with quiet confidence, even if she appeared uncertain. It was subtle, but enough to pique his attention. The first days were a delicate balance of friction and adaptation. Clara struggled to learn the layout of the sprawling ranch, the precise order of the morning chores, and the expectations of Ethan himself. She often clashed with his methods, questioning his insistence on perfection in minor details. Her voice, though polite, carried a natural firmness that surprised him. "You don't need to fold the linens with exact corners," she remarked one afternoon, adjusting a blanket in the guest room. "They're going to be used again tomorrow." Ethan's brow arched. "Order and precision prevent mistakes," he replied. "That's how this ranch functions. And mistakes can happen even if the linens are perfect," she countered gently. "Sometimes practicality is better than perfection." He studied her for a long moment, recognizing in her words a confidence that was both challenging and admirable. It irritated him in the sense that it disrupted his control, but it also stirred a curiosity he hadn't felt in years. Despite the tension, small moments of connection began to emerge. Clara displayed remarkable skill in managing the household and assisting the ranch hands, not simply completing tasks but anticipating needs. She adjusted meal preparations to the preferences of the workers, organized supplies efficiently, and handled unexpected crises with composure. Ethan found himself observing her quietly, noticing the way she interacted with others with respect, patience, and a warmth that softened even the roughest ranch hands. She earned subtle glances of approval from his employees, and he, in turn, felt an unexpected swell of pride. It was pride not just in her abilities, but in the person she was, the careful balance of strength and kindness that he had not expected to find in someone bound to him by a contract. Evenings were the most challenging. Sharing meals in the Caldwell dining hall, their conversations were tentative, filled with polite discussion of tasks, weather, and ranch matters. Neither dared breach the delicate barrier between them, though both felt the undercurrent of something more. Ethan noticed her smile when a horse was properly tamed, her laugh at a harmless joke among the ranch hands. Clara, meanwhile, began to see a softness behind Ethan's stern demeanor. A man who valued order but secretly yearned for companionship he didn't know how to ask for, yet the boundaries were clear. Clara reminded herself constantly that this was not love, it was survival. Ethan reminded himself that she was not a companion, yet she was part of an arrangement. And still, both felt the subtle pull of something neither had anticipated, respect evolving into admiration, admiration morphing into something warmer, softer, and more dangerous to acknowledge. By the end of the week, their world had shifted subtly. The friction that had defined the first days was giving way to understanding. Clara realized she could navigate this ranch and perhaps even thrive in. Ethan realized that this young woman brought light, spirit, and quiet courage into his otherwise controlled and solitary life, though neither admitted it aloud. Both began to sense that the arrangement that had brought them together could transform into something far more meaningful. The first cracks in the walls around their hearts had begun to form, quietly, steadily, and irrevocably. The Caldwell Ranch was a place of routine, hard work, and unspoken rules. But the morning that the accident happened, those routines were disrupted, and both Clara and Ethan discovered sides of each other they had never anticipated. It began with a simple task, a supply run to the far pasture to check on the new livestock. Clara had insisted on accompanying one of the ranch hands to see the animals for herself. Ethan, who preferred to oversee operations alone, had initially objected, but she had persisted with quiet determination. Her insistence was part of her nature, he realized, part of the courage and independence he had begun to notice and, to his own surprise, admire. The sky was overcast, clouds heavy with rain. As they rode across the pastures, the wind picked up, making the horses restless. Clara laughed nervously, trying to calm hers as she followed behind Ethan, but the ground was slick, and a misstep from one of the horses sent it stumbling toward a ditch. Clara's horse panicked, and she was thrown, hitting the ground hard. Ethan was immediately at her side. His stoic control gave way to instinct, and he knelt beside her, checking for injuries, his hands surprisingly gentle despite their rough calluses. Clara, stunned but shaken rather than seriously hurt, looked up at him and saw something she had never expected: worry, raw and unfiltered. His eyes softened, losing the usual stern edge, and for a moment he seemed less like the rigid rancher she had come to know, and more like a man who feared the world would take someone he cared for. "You're hurt," he said finally, voice low and steady. "Tell me where it hurts." Clara shook her head quickly. "I'll be fine." "Just a bruise." She tried to sit up, but Ethan's strong hands gently held her in place. "Stay still." His touch was firm but careful, a silent message of protection. She realized then how much he truly valued her, not as a contract, not as a responsibility, but as a person. It stirred a warmth in her chest she hadn't anticipated. She had come expecting a transactional relationship, and yet here was this man showing care and concern without pretense. Over the next few hours, as Ethan helped her mount a calm horse and guided her back to the ranch house, the walls between them began to crumble. Clara listened to him speak not just about the accident, but about his life, about the nights spent worrying over the ranch, the years of solitude he had imposed on himself, and the weight of expectation that rested on his shoulders. She shared small pieces of herself as well, revealing glimpses of the hardship she had endured, the family debt, the fear of failure, and the loneliness that had colored her childhood. For the first time, they saw each other not through the lens of contract or duty, but through the lens of human vulnerability. By the time they returned to the ranch house, the rain had begun to fall in earnest. The kitchen lanterns cast a soft glow over the interior, reflecting off Clara's damp hair and the streaks of dirt on Ethan's face from the pasture. They were soaked, exhausted, but something intangible had shifted. The day's events had forged a bond deeper than either had expected, a connection that transcended obligation and hinted at mutual respect, and, quietly, attraction. That evening, during dinner, their interactions were markedly different. The easy tension of their first week had evolved into subtle understanding. Ethan observed her quietly, noticing how she smiled when one of the ranch hands recounted a humorous story, how her hands moved deftly as she served the meal, and how she met his eyes with calm assurance rather than fear. Clara, in turn, noticed his protective glances, the unspoken concern in his posture, and the rare softness in his voice when he addressed her directly. Neither spoke of what had happened, nor did they address the unspoken bond forming between them. There was no confession, no declaration. Yet the atmosphere in the Caldwell Ranch had changed irrevocably. The first cracks in their emotional armor had widened. What had begun as mere obligation was transforming into something more complex, something neither dared name but both could feel. By the end of the night, as Clara prepared for bed, she realized that she no longer feared Ethan, not entirely. There was tension, yes, but also safety, warmth, and the hint of trust. And Ethan, sitting alone in his office reviewing ranch records, felt an unfamiliar pull toward the woman who had entered his life as a contractual obligation but had quickly become far more, someone who might awaken parts of him he had long buried. In the quiet of that night, both understood something unspoken yet undeniable. The transactional nature of their marriage was beginning to give way to a profound, mutual vulnerability, and with it the first stirrings of true connection. The Caldwell Ranch had never been completely free of danger, but over the past week the unease had grown. Rumors had reached Ethan that bandits were moving through neighboring territories, preying on isolated homesteads and ranches. Supplies had gone missing from other properties, and livestock had been stolen under cover of night. He had fortified the ranch as best he could, reinforcing fences, securing gates, and briefing the ranch hands on vigilance. Yet, despite all precautions, the knowledge that Clara was on the property, a young, spirited woman with no experience of such dangers, gnawed at him. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the distant hills and the wind carried the chill of an approaching storm, Clara was preparing dinner in the kitchen. Ethan entered silently, his expression more serious than usual. "We may have company tonight," he said, voice low, almost a growl. "Some men have been spotted near the northern fence." Clara's hands froze mid-chop. "Men? Do you mean thieves?" Ethan nodded, scanning the horizon through the kitchen window. "Possibly. I won't take chances. Stay inside, lock the doors. Don't let anyone in but me." Clara swallowed, nodding quickly. She had begun to feel secure on the ranch, believing the walls of routine and diligence provided safety. But this intrusion threatened everything. Still, fear alone didn't define her. Clara had already shown resilience and courage, and now it was time to act not recklessly, but decisively. As night fell, the sounds of the ranch changed. Dogs barked sharply in the distance, their alertness cutting through the quiet. Lanterns flickered across the porches and hallways, casting shadows that danced like specters across the wooden walls. The tension was palpable, a coiled wire ready to spring. Ethan's presence was constant, his shadow near Clara at all times, protective and unwavering. When the first noises came from the north fence, scraping, snapping, the unmistakable sound of wood giving way, Ethan's instincts took over. He grabbed his rifle and moved toward the disturbance. While Clara watched, heart pounding, but refusing to retreat completely. She had learned to trust him in ways she hadn't anticipated. She knew he would protect her, but she also felt an urgency to be ready, to act if necessary. The confrontation was brief but tense. Ethan and his men discovered intruders attempting to drive away part of the livestock. Shouts pierced the night, commands barked, and horses stampeded in confusion. Through it all, Ethan's focus never wavered from Clara's safety, ensuring she remained behind him and out of harm's way. Clara's courage also emerged, helping corral frightened animals, guiding frightened hands, and keeping composure under pressure. It was not the life she had envisioned when agreeing to this contract, yet it revealed her strength and adaptability. After the intruders were driven off or fled into the darkness, the aftermath was quiet but heavy with adrenaline. Clara and Ethan returned to the main house, both soaked from rain and mud, both exhausted. The storm outside mirrored the storm within them, the heightened awareness, the pounding hearts, the tension that had become nearly unbearable. Sitting together in the warmth of the kitchen, lanterns casting soft glows over their damp clothing, a different kind of intimacy began to form. Ethan finally allowed himself a glance he had kept hidden for days at Clara. At her bravery, her quick thinking, her calm presence under pressure. He realized with an almost frightening clarity that his concern for her had become personal, deep, and undeniable. She was no longer merely a bride by contract. She had become someone whose safety and happiness he could not ignore. Clara, in turn, observed Ethan in a new light. He was no longer simply a strict, distant rancher. He was vulnerable in his care. For her, fiercely protective and aware of emotions he did not yet articulate. She began to understand that the man she had first thought of as cold and distant was capable of great warmth and depth, a depth that was slowly drawing her in despite the circumstances of their arranged marriage. That night, the Caldwell Ranch was quiet again, the threat gone, the animals calm. Yet both Clara and Ethan carried within them a heightened awareness of their connection. Danger had illuminated their bond, revealing trust, courage, and unspoken admiration. The trials they faced together had begun to forge a stronger, more intimate link, one that neither contract nor obligation could define. By the end of the night, Clara realized that she was no longer simply fulfilling a role. She was becoming a partner in a real sense, one whose heart and instincts mattered. And Ethan, sitting alone later with the rifle still at his side, felt the first stirrings of a different kind of attachment, a longing not born of duty, but of desire to protect, cherish, and perhaps someday love. The Caldwell Ranch had survived another night, and the danger that had threatened the property only heightened the bond between Clara and Ethan. In the quiet aftermath, a subtle shift occurred, a softening of barriers, a recognition that their connection was no longer defined by contract or obligation. The storm had passed outside, but inside, emotions that had long been restrained began to surface, tentative and fragile, yet undeniable. It was late in the evening when Clara found herself alone in the kitchen, preparing bread dough for the next day. The lantern cast a gentle glow over the wooden counters, illuminating her focused expression and the dusting of flour on her hands. She was tired but restless. The adrenaline from the previous night still lingered in her chest. Her mind kept replaying Ethan's protective stance, the way he had guided her away from danger, and the fierce concern in his eyes. She had come to expect practicality and control from him, but she had not anticipated the depth of feeling that lay beneath his stoic exterior. The soft creak of the door drew her attention, and she froze. "Clara?" The voice was unmistakable, low, steady, yet tinged with something softer than she had ever heard from him. Ethan stepped into the kitchen, coat damp from the storm earlier, hair slightly tousled, boots leaving faint traces on the wooden floor. He paused, taking in the sight of her kneading dough, the faint smile that tugged at her lips despite her fatigue, and the quiet determination in her posture. "You shouldn't be up so late," he said. Almost a reproach, but his tone carried warmth beneath it. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face, "and the bread needed attention." He nodded, moving closer, but careful to respect the distance between them. There was tension in the air, an unspoken energy that had been building for weeks, the subtle pull of mutual respect and something more primal, more tender. He did not touch her, but the mere presence of him in the room created a warmth that flourished between them. Ethan's voice softened as he spoke again. "After last night, I've realized something." Clara looked up, curiosity and apprehension mingling in her eyes. "What is it?" He hesitated, the restraint in his posture betraying the emotions he had carefully concealed for so long. I've been lonely, Clara, more than I thought possible. And seeing you last night, seeing you handle yourself, seeing your courage, it made me realize how much I've been missing." Clara's chest tightened. She had felt a similar pull drawn to him, not because of duty, but because of his quiet strength, his protective instincts, and the glimpses of vulnerability he rarely showed. "Ethan?" she began, then paused. Unsure how to articulate the feelings that had taken root in her heart, he took a tentative step closer. "I don't know how to say this without sounding foolish," he admitted, "but I care for you. Not because of the contract, not because I am obliged, but because I see you. Clara, truly see you." Her hand unconsciously rested on the edge of the counter, fingers curling slightly as if grounding herself against the intensity of his words. "I feel the same," she whispered, the admission releasing weeks of unspoken tension. "I've tried to ignore it, but I can't. I see you too, more than just the rancher or the man I was contracted to marry." For a moment, the kitchen was silent except for the faint tick of the lantern. The weight of their confessions settled into the space between them, creating a delicate, electric stillness. They were no longer two people bound by obligation. They were two hearts recognizing a connection that had grown organically, nurtured through shared trials, moments of vulnerability, and quiet observation. Ethan finally allowed himself to close the gap slightly, not touching her but leaning just enough that the warmth of their proximity was undeniable. "Then we will figure this out," he said softly. "Together. Whatever this becomes." Clara nodded, feeling a sense of relief and anticipation mingling within her. "Together," she echoed, though there were no grand declarations, no sweeping gestures. The understanding between them was profound. The contract that had brought them together no longer defined them. Their bond was now rooted in mutual respect, admiration, and a budding love that had been quietly forming, nurtured by trust, courage, and shared experiences. As they stood there, bathed in the golden lantern light, both knew that the future was uncertain, yet infinitely more promising than it had ever been. The awakening of their hearts marked the beginning of a true partnership, one built not on obligation or price, but on choice, care, and the courage to hope. The Caldwell Ranch was quiet that morning. The first light of dawn spilling across the fields in soft golden hues. The events of the previous nights, the threat, the storm, the adrenaline-fueled tension had left a lasting impression on both Clara and Ethan. They had faced danger together, navigated fear and uncertainty, and in doing so, discovered a bond that neither obligation nor contract could define. Now, in the stillness of the early day, that bond began to take shape in something tangible, something real. Love. Clara moved through the kitchen with a sense of purpose, preparing breakfast for the ranch hands who would soon rise to begin their daily chores. She was more at ease than she had been in weeks, a quiet confidence in her movements. The events of the past few days had revealed to her a truth she could not ignore. Ethan Caldwell was no longer merely a stern, distant rancher or a contractual husband. He was a man capable of warmth, vulnerability, and deep care. As she had come to care for him in return, more than she had anticipated or thought possible, Ethan entered the kitchen, just as Clara set the last loaf of bread on the counter. He paused, watching her work, taking in the gentle curve of her movements, the quiet strength in her stance, and the subtle, graceful way she carried herself. He no longer saw her as a solution to a problem or as a contractual obligation. She had become someone whose presence grounded him, whose courage inspired him, and whose heart he longed to protect. "Morning," he said softly, voice low but warm. Clara turned, meeting his gaze, and for a moment the world beyond the kitchen ceased to exist. The ranch hands were still outside, the livestock lowing in the distance, the sun rising over the fields, but none of that mattered. All that mattered was the understanding between them, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had taken together. Clara smiled, a shy but genuine curve of her lips. "Morning," she replied. Her voice carried the ease of someone who had discovered safety not only in the walls of the ranch, but in the man standing before her. Ethan approached her slowly, his expression measured but tender. "Last night, I realized I don't want to just protect you. I want to stand with you in everything." Clara's heart fluttered. She had felt the same, though fear and caution had kept her silent. "I feel the same," she whispered. "I don't just want to be safe. I want to be with you in every way I can." There was no need for grand gestures or dramatic declarations. The simple honesty of their words, the sincerity in their eyes, conveyed more than any act could. The trust, respect, and admiration that had grown between them over weeks of shared experiences now blossomed into something deeper, love that was patient, tender, and real. Outside, the ranch was awakening. Horses trotted across the fields, the wind carried the scent of freshly turned earth, and the sun bathed the property in warmth. Inside, Ethan reached for Clara's hand, his fingers brushing against hers with gentle certainty. It was a gesture of promise, of partnership, of choice. He did not demand her love, nor did he attempt to rush the bond they had formed. He offered it freely, openly, and with reverence for the heart that had willingly met his own. Clara's hand tightened around his. She felt the steady strength of his grasp, the warmth that radiated from him, and the unspoken commitment in the look he gave her. She realized that love, unlike the marriage contract that had brought them together, could not be forced or bought. It was something earned through trust, courage, and the willingness to see one another fully. And in Ethan's eyes, she saw reflected the same awakening she had felt within herself, a heart no longer constrained by obligation, but free to hope, to care, and to love. The rest of the day passed in quiet joy. Together they walked the fields, inspected the fences, and tended to the livestock not as master and bride, but as partners, equals, and friends. The ranch, which had been a place of routine and control, now became a canvas for their shared life, a space where love could grow organically. Nurtured by understanding, respect, and courage. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with streaks of amber and rose, Clara and Ethan stood on the porch, looking out over the land that had brought them together. Side by side, hands entwined, they understood that their journey had only just begun. The marriage that had been bought with money had transformed into a union born of hearts awakened, of love discovered beyond the confines of obligation, and of hope embraced fully. In that moment, both knew without question they had chosen each other, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. And that choice, more than any contract or promise, was the foundation of a love that would endure, deep, abiding, and free.